burden. It's clear, cogent, and convincing evidence. And that's why I place more importance on the fact of the allegation that there was an agreement that they can't establish, because I think that negative weighs better for the analysis that I am asserting for you than the one that you are concerned about up there. Because I think if there really was that, you're going to hear some testimony of some way, shape, or form that there is some sort of agreement on limiting that testimony. And what you've heard, and I'd like to go back and respond to that a little bit about, I've already went over what went on back in chambers. I think that's an acknowledgement that he missed it, that they should have had it, and I'm not saying they should. And then you go back in and they said that he didn't ask any questions of Dr. Meehan at that hearing. And so what happened is you look at the first part of the hearing, and you have on page 61 where Meehan's ultimately testifying. I don't have the one with the exhibit marker on it.
It's 251.
All right. No. This is the December 15th.
Okay. I'm sorry.
December
15th.
I believe it's around 2:30.
I'm with you.
And there was a question asked of Dr. Meehan at the December 15th hearing, and it says, and he asked you to create a report that didn't show that. Is that correct? He was referencing some of the stuff there. Well, those weren't his words. He didn't ask me specifically to exclude those, okay? And I think what you're splitting hairs and you're looking for language, Mr. Nifong did not request that I exclude data from evidence specimens specifically. And then Mike goes back in the back of the deposition. They said they didn't question him about it. You go back to page 90 of that same exhibit, and Mike's asking him questions. Did you attempt to put in less than the full truth with respect to this? No. So would it be a fair reading of your statement, 3 of the reference specimens are consistent to infer from that none of the other ones were consistent? I would think that would be fair. I think that's what we intended in that statement. Did anyone ever tell you to conceal or hide any of your results from anybody? No. And then you go back, and one other thing that I thought was, we had his deposition testimony on the same issue, and this is on page 135 of the deposition that was submitted as my exhibit 2.
That's Dr. Meehan's?
Yes. And it goes back and says, and I think you explained that reason. It wasn't probative in this context, was that Mr. Nifong had requested that the report have the items of evidence that matched reference specimens. I believe this is in response to a question from Mr. Brocker. That's correct. But what's not correct on this statement is that he said only include the information. He did not say that, and I can't say this too often and make it be clear. He never told me to exclude, never specifically told me to exclude or put information or not put information on the report. He wanted a report that showed matching of evidence items to evidence items up to that point at the interim.
Well, isn't it that right there? He wanted a report of matching items that by logical necessity excludes everything else, including the DNA of the unidentified males.
Yeah, I think you could interpret it that way if you want to, but I think you need to have some other, I think, obviously can, but I think you can have, the other interpretation of it was he was trying to find out, and I think you heard testimony about this, he was trying to find out what items matched, and that was his thought process. Now, he should have gone back in and say, okay, in order to comply with all my duties, I also need to have this, that, or the other, but it's also somebody that in the reports that he was accustomed to, the labs that he was accustomed to working with, they always provided the report that had everything that was unquestioned. And that's where I think you got somebody that is dealing in a situation where he's so used to reports coming in one format that he's not sitting there really thinking about what he has to do with an expert to provide a scientific report in a manner that it should be to be presented in court. Clearly he should have. And I'm not taking Mr. Nifong's responsibilities away by having Dr. Meehan in the equation, but I think when you're dealing with the new subject matter, the science of the DNA, the reporting, and you're outside of your normal field that you've been in for all those years, I think it's reasonable to not really go into that and really study what you're required to do to make certain something's there and something's not. And then you get back up through the proceeding and just didn't go back and look at that.
Well, and you mentioned something that kind of is also generally on my mind, which I think is reflected in the statement that you just read about how we were looking for positive matches to the lacrosse players. One thing that concerns me in determining Mr. Nifong's intent is that it seems throughout all he was looking for was evidence to link the lacrosse players to a crime, with blinders on to evidence that tended to show that there was no such connection.
Well, on that subject, I believe that what the evidence was that came out was Dr. Meehan and he both understood there was going to be additional testing that was going to be done after the May 12th report. And they did do additional testing, and if you look at Officer Hyman's notes, and I believe Officer Gottlieb's notes, but I know Hyman's notes, not only did they go get buccal swabs from the boyfriend, there was a Jarrell Johnson that was interviewed by Sergeant Gottlieb on some date, and he admitted that he had had sexual relations with the victim on March 9th. They went and got a buccal swab from him. They also went and got a buccal swab, if I'm not mistaken, from a Mr. Young. And those were all submitted back to DNA Securities, and they were all tested by DNA Securities. So they were following up on other individuals in the investigation in an effort to see whether those individuals' DNA ultimately matched. Yeah, the boyfriend's, I believe, was the one that matched, but they did submit these other people going on. And if you go back and look at Hyman's notes, you'll see where they'll go and try to get those further up exams, or going through trying to get the exams from the other individuals that were going on. So I think the evidence is that there were other avenues they were going. The primary understanding, I think the way this all started was they were looking at who they understood was at the party, and that's the group that they were working with, but they were also working with other outside information that the investigators had found and followed up on.
Well, and also in his response, which I believe was made without benefit of counsel at the time, he expressly said, I was focusing on finding evidence that linked or matched these players to the crime, and I was not really focusing on what might be exculpatory. I'm asking you in a general way because, as you know, we're dealing with intent here. What evidence is there that that attitude ever changed at any time through today?
Well, I don't know that there's any evidence through the time he recused himself that has changed. He is, and we had Judge Brannon that was here testifying yesterday. I'm not saying this is right, but I'm saying he testified yesterday that and we do criminal defense stuff, so we like it the new way, mind you. But he testified. We like it the new way, but the old way was the defendants weren't entitled to discovery. You didn't need to give it to them.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of interesting, his statement that every time I gave him the open file, I had to go try the case. Like they figured out they had something to try.
I do. I thought it was interesting too, but that was the way that it was in this state until the mid-90s up to the present, and there are a few of them remaining that is the system that they grew up in, and that was the thought process they have, and so he was trying to solve a crime, and the issue of all this exculpatory stuff didn't really start developing until the latter part of the 90s, early 2000s. Yeah, and I think in North Carolina it took a little bit longer for it to get to the status where it is with the amendment to the statute back in 2004. So I think that can be the attitude of the old, I'm going to try it the old way. I got somebody to put them up in the stand. I get to the jury. They certainly do it. They didn't even used to have to give you the name of the witnesses that were going to testify. You just go in there and they'd throw them up there. You wouldn't get statements. And that's
Yeah,
that's
but
an old
that was
culture.
really the old-fashioned way, and we're not dealing with that anymore.